Civil War. So I'm going to go through your study guide and give you the answers. So basically, if you pay attention to this, you memorize all this, good luck, and then you'll be able to do well on our test. I'm not sure why secede compromise is one word there, but how did the cotton gin impact slavery? So slavery was just about dead in the United States. A lot of states thought it was not necessary anymore, and then this happened, the cotton gin.
Separating the seeds. For years, it could only be done by hand. 1 pound took an entire day. A simple patent filed on March 4th, 1794, changes all that. The cotton gin. It automates the process and deeply divides the country.
The cotton gin transformed not only America, but the world. The concept of mass production using a machine just exploded everywhere.
One man can now process 50 times more cotton. Output skyrockets all over the South. In 1830,
Okay, so that's actually enough. You don't need to know all that. What you need to know is it made cotton a lot more profitable. So they're about ready to get rid of slavery. One person could only clean 1 pound of cotton in a day, and all of a sudden this new machine comes out and they could clean 50 pounds. Well, it can clean it, but it can't pick it. So they needed more slaves to be able to pick the cotton so they could clean it, so they could make more money. So the cotton gin impacted slavery by making a new need for more slaves. Okay, that was an Eli Whitney invention, but you need to know that is really what kept slavery driving. Okay, make sure you have these in the right order. I believe 1850 is before 1820 on your sheet. Double check, make sure that you're filling out the right one, because we're going to talk about the Missouri Compromise first, because the Missouri Compromise happened 20 years before the Compromise of 1850. So the Missouri Compromise, we're going to open this up, and the sides are basically this. Ignore my phone, I apologize. The North and the South, always the North and the South. And it's the free, what's shown in green, and the slave states shown in red here. So Missouri wants to join, and the North and the South say, nope, we have fair teams for kickball already, you can't play Missouri. And Missouri wants to join. The problem is, the conflict is, there are an even number of free and slave states right now. And so if Missouri joins, there's going to be an imbalance. So what was decided? They said, yes, Missouri, you can join, but if you zoom in, New Hampshire was this big, huge section up here, and they divided New Hampshire into two, and they made Maine a new state. So they added both Missouri and Maine. So there is 2 states added, so it's still fair. Who thought of it? This strapping young fellow, Henry Clay. He's the great compromiser. And the other thing they did was they added this black line right underneath of Missouri, and they said only states below Missouri's bottom line, the 36th parallel, can become slave states, which means that the free states could potentially get all this blue unorganized territory, and the red states could only get this for slave states. So it kind of was not a great thing for the slave states, because they weren't going to be able to get as much territory. So that is the Missouri Compromise of 1820, and nope, don't need to save my changes. Then the Compromise of 1850, again, make sure you have the right one here. But again, it's going to be the North versus the South, and we'll open this up. The Missouri Compromise was adding Missouri. Compromise of 1850, they wanted to add California. You'll notice this map looks a lot different than this map. Mexico, Spanish-owned, was a lot of this gray territory, and there's a war in between those times. We gained all this territory. California said, hey, I want to play kickball, and the free and slave states again said, no, we have fair teams. And California said, please, and they said, okay. So they decided to admit California to the Union, and if you look at the bottom line of Missouri, it divides right through California, right? So if they followed the Missouri Compromise, it really doesn't fit. So they said, okay, California, yes, we'll let you into the Union, and you can be a free state. All of a sudden, it loses the balance. And the Utah Territory and New Mexico Territory, they kind of said we're going to throw out that whole parallel thing from the Missouri Compromise, and we'll let Utah and New Mexico decide when they decide to join the Union. They get to decide on their own. They have popular sovereignty. They get to do whatever is popular in their state, and they get to decide. So the North gets California, but that's not fair because the South doesn't get anything. That's not much of a compromise. And again, Henry Clay was the main author of this. So they get the Fugitive Slave Act, which basically says if anybody escapes from the South to the North who is a slave, that Southern slave owner can go up into the North and they can bring them back. Essentially what this does is it almost legalizes kidnapping of African American people. They'd go up into the North and they'd say, "You were a slave," and they'd say, "No, I wasn't," and they'd take them anyway. And if it went to court, I believe you know this already, but the magistrates, the judges would basically get paid $10 to declare them a slave and $5 to declare them free. Sounds pretty crooked. So the North gets California as a free state. The South gets a Fugitive Slave Act. Back to our handy dandy handout. The next thing is the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So these kind of all build on top of each other. So the next picture is going to show how they build. So the Missouri Compromise, again, Missouri goes to the slave states, Maine goes to the free states. Nobody above the free line, the 36-degree parallel, could be a slave state. Then the Compromise of 1850. California kind of throws that out the window because they're right in between, so they get admitted as a free state. And then there's the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, on top of that, the next thing, Utah and New Mexico kind of set up that free popular sovereignty idea. And Kansas and Nebraska are now looking at being admitted. And so the Kansas-Nebraska Act said popular sovereignty. These two states get to do whatever is popular in their state. They get to vote and they get to decide. So that means that everybody down south, not everybody, a lot of people down south really want slavery to be approved there because it's the balance of powers. So they all flood into Kansas, and all the people from the north flood into Kansas. So you have all these people headed there that are extremists. Like most people, they care about these issues, but they're not going to move for it or go pretend to live a few states away. Keep in mind they can't take an airplane or a bus or something to get there. They all go to Kansas and they end up fighting and a lot killing each other. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act essentially was there's popular sovereignty. They got to decide if they're slave or free, and that led to a lot of fighting and bloodshed. Also led to Bleeding Kansas. That's also one of the things listed on your study guide is Bleeding Kansas. Important person to note with that is John Brown. John Brown, while we're talking about him, he had a few boys, and he and his boys decided they were going to go capture a whole bunch of weapons from the South, and they were going to have a whole bunch of slaves join them and fight in this big uprising, and they were going to overtake a lot of the slave state area. And what the problem was none of the slaves joined them, and it was just him and his boys. All of his boys get killed. John gets sentenced to death via hanging. So John Brown gets killed there. Election of 1860, a couple things to know with this. Stephen Douglas had squared off against Abraham Lincoln once already, and Stephen Douglas won the Senate, but it made Abraham Lincoln's name get out there. This is the first time that Abraham Lincoln really got any publicity, so even though he lost, he kind of won in that people found out who he was. So in this election, Stephen Douglas, he likes the idea of popular sovereignty. Every state gets to decide for themselves. John Breckinridge likes slavery. He's a slave owner. He's from the South. Abe Lincoln doesn't like slavery. He doesn't want to get rid of slavery, but he does want to stop the spread of slavery. He knows that if the free states keep growing, there's more and more free states, and the slave states don't get any bigger, eventually the free states are going to choke off the concept of slavery. So in the election, Abe Lincoln wins. John Breckinridge gets the majority of the votes from the South. Abe Lincoln, the majority of the votes from the North. If we looked at the map that we showed from the election, we would see that it was pretty split. Not very even at all. Everybody up north goes Lincoln, everybody down south goes Breckinridge, and clearly there's a divide in who they want and what they want for their country. So they go to war. They go to war. Why? Well, the South goes because they want to keep slavery, and also in the very beginning, there were these taxes, these tariffs that made it so the northern states who had a lot of factories would benefit, and the southern states would essentially have to pay more money, lose more money. And so they didn't like the taxes, and they also wanted to keep the slaves. So that's why the South wanted to fight. The North wanted to fight primarily to keep the Union, to keep the United States together, because they had already kind of won the presidential election. So they were going to be getting their way. So now they wanted the South to join them in getting their way. Advantages of the North in the war, if you think about the maps that we had, that we walked around the room looking at the different types. Let's see if we can pull up some of those maps. If I can find them. Pre-war environment. Here we go. The railroads were a big thing. So this is picture one, the railroads. The North has significantly more railroads. So if they run out of ammunition, they run out of guns, they run out of supplies, marching boots, food, anything, they can pretty easily ship them around. Big advantage for the North is they have more railroads. Advantage for the South, you notice that these are almost all pink, so they're all 5-inch track gauges, which means trains can go from one place to the next place, where here, the blue, they're 4 feet 10 inches, they can only go so far, and then they're going to have to unload everything and load it onto something else. So it's a little more time consuming to move things around. There are more railroads in the North. That's a benefit for them. Benefit for the South, almost all the railroads are on the same gauge, meaning that one train could run through all of them without having to get on a different train. One of the other major things is the factories. We'll jump on down to the factories. So manufacturing, you can just glance at this map. You don't really have to study it. And you can see that there are way more factories in the North, which means, again, they're going to be able to produce bullets and guns and boots and whatever they need right next to their battlegrounds, right next to them. They can replenish the supply very quickly and easily, especially with those railroads. Where in the South, they don't have as many factories. So let's say Arkansas, who has next to no factories, runs out of bullets. It's not like they're going to say, hey, Illinois, can you send some bullets down so we can shoot them at you? That doesn't work, right? So huge benefit for the North is they have significantly more factories. They also have a lot more people in the North. It's much more heavily populated, and so they have more soldiers. In one of our videos, it said right away from the get-go they had 2.5 million soldiers in the North, and they had 800,000 in the South. So more population, more fighters. Another popular opinion among historians, though, was that the South had better trained fighters and better trained generals. So that would be edge to the South. So altogether, Cliff Notes, main reason, advantages for the North, more railroads, more people, more soldiers. Advantages for the South, uniform railroads, more skilled fighters, better trained generals. There's 3 reasons for each there. Talk about John Brown. Dred Scott had an owner. He was a slave. He had an owner who traveled around a lot. He went up into the North, and the North was free. Right? So if we looked at a map, he moved up north into the free territories, and he lived there for a while. And so Dred Scott said, hey, while I was up there, I was free. So he moved back down south to Missouri, and his owner died, and he sued for his freedom. He said, I'm a free man. I lived in the free territory, therefore I should be free. And the courts ruled against him. And one of the other names on here, Roger Taney, was a Supreme Court justice that said, nope, you are property, and therefore you shall always be property. So that was a Dred Scott decision. That's who Robert Taney is. Frederick Douglass was a slave. He escaped slavery. He could read and he could write. Extremely good orator or speaker, and extremely famous individual for the speeches he gave against slavery. Harriet Tubman was an Underground Railroad conductor. She was a slave who escaped, and she went back and helped hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of other people escape slavery. Henry Clay, we talked about him earlier. He's the great compromiser. Sojourner Truth was not her original name. She changed her name to Sojourner, which means traveler of truth. She would travel around and tell people the truth about slavery. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was about slavery, and it gave a lot of the abolitionists ammunition. It gave them passion about ending slavery because it exposed how terrible slavery was. Jefferson Davis, he's the other one who won the election. So Abraham Lincoln, but after the South broke off, the South said, we're going to be our own country, the Confederate States of America, and they elected Jefferson Davis to be their new president. On the backside, Samuel Cornish and John Russwurm, they were African Americans. They were free, and they started a newspaper called Freedom's Journal. William Lloyd Garrison, kind of similar, except for he was not a slave. He was a white Northerner, and he started a newspaper called The Liberator. Underground Railroad, probably should know that. Just a system to help slaves escape. It wasn't really underground. It wasn't really a railroad. It was just a way to transport slaves up north secretly. The Drinking Gourd. I just downloaded a picture of this. I'm not sure where it ended up, though, so we could go on a little hunt to try to find my Drinking Gourd picture. The Drinking Gourd, though, is the Big Dipper. Here we go. The Big Dipper. This is what the Big Dipper looks like in the sky. And if you look at the tail end and you follow it, it points to Polaris, which is the North Star, which is the very tip of the Little Dipper. So if you follow the Drinking Gourd, you're following where it's pointing to go north. You want to go north, of course, because that way, that's the direction that slaves would go to freedom. Initially, it was just to get to the northern United States, and eventually it was to try to get up into Canada. A conductor is somebody who helped work on the Underground Railroad, like Harriet Tubman, helped lead people to freedom. The Mason-Dixon line is the line in between, let's see if I can pull up like any map. It's the line in between Maryland, which is right up here, and Pennsylvania, right up there. Pennsylvania is in the orange, Maryland is in the green. So the Mason-Dixon line is the line between the slave states and the free states. It's what slaves had to get past to be free. Abolish means to get rid of. In this case, abolish slavery. An abolitionist, if you look at the root word, abolish, it's people who wanted to abolish slavery or get rid of slavery, which is the owning of other humans against their will. Sectionalism. Pulled up the same map a few 100,000 times here today, but sectionalism is the idea that each place is going to vote for their ideas and their beliefs. So if you think about the North and the South, there were huge sections. We looked at the map. That'd be something better to pull up. We looked at the map of who voted for who in the election, and it was extremely divided, where the North voted for things that they wanted. A lot of factories up north, a lot of people who wanted slavery to end, a lot of people who needed slavery down here for their lifestyle. So they voted for what their section of the country wanted. That is what sectionalism is. Tariff is like a tax, and it's relevant because they placed a tax that affected a lot of the southern states, made them angry. States' rights, there's an argument about who should be in charge, who should get to decide. Should it be popular sovereignty, such should each state get to decide what they do, or should the federal government decide? And we still kind of have some states' rights, federal discussions today about who should be in charge of what. Our Constitution outlines it, and ultimately the federal government, or the whole union, the United States, gets to overpower the individual states. But states' rights are what do the states get to decide for themselves. Relevant, again, because there's the debate on should the federal government get to decide on slavery, or should there be popular sovereignty within that state. A territory is a land owned by a government, but it's not yet a state, so they didn't have representation. We talked about the numbers here. So Iowa has a 4 here, Missouri has a 9 here. That's how many electors they have to vote for the presidential election. Currently, present day, California has 54 electors, where Nebraska only has 5. So that's representation, right? The states get representation. They get 2 senators, and then they get people in the House of Representatives, and they get to represent that state. But if you're a territory, then you don't get any representation, but you're just kind of bossed around by the country. The country still owns you, the country still protects you, but you don't get a vote. We still do have some commonwealths and some territories right now in the United States. We don't need to get into that right now, though. Slave state and free state, those are pretty self-explanatory. You're slave state if you allowed slavery, or free state if you do not. Compromise is if you say black and I say white, we go with gray, we meet in the middle. Neither one of us gets exactly what we want, but we're both happy. Similar to the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850, both the North and the South, 2 different sides, 2 different ideas came together, and they both kind of got part of what they want. A code is like a law, or not a law, a guide. So there were codes that, kind of like a secret code for the abolitionists, for the Underground Railroad. They couldn't come right out and say, hey, we're going to sneak north tonight. Instead, they spoke in code, or they sang songs. General facts about Abraham Lincoln and his life. I'm not going to tell you what to do for this part, but we spent a day looking at Abraham Lincoln and his life, and you went through the different stations. We talked about JFK comparisons between him and Abe Lincoln, young Abe Lincoln and how he liked wrestling, the Emancipation Proclamation. So this hasn't happened yet in history with where we're at, but right towards the end of this whole Civil War chapter, he gives the Emancipation Proclamation, which just says slaves are free. And of course, at the time, he didn't have control of the South. He had lost control of the South, and so whether or not he really set them free is up for debate. But the Emancipation Proclamation just announced the slaves are free. The Gettysburg Address was a very, very short speech that he gave at the site of the Battle of Gettysburg. How he died, we had talked about the differences between Jesus and between Abraham Lincoln and the people in fairly recent history who came and tried to dig up Abe Lincoln's body and hold it ransom and get their buddies out of jail. And the big difference there is Abraham Lincoln stayed dead. Jesus rose from the dead. They buried Abraham Lincoln's body and hid his body after this had happened. And they weren't allowed to talk about where it was. And the other difference we talked about was Jesus's disciples continued to talk about him, and they couldn't be quiet about him. Anyway, think of a few things from those stations that you remember. I'll ask you just to tell me a few facts about Abraham Lincoln's life that you learned. Confederacy, or the Confederate States of America, that's the South after they broke off. So we look at all these maps. The green is the South, and they broke off. They made the Confederate States of America, also known as a Confederacy. On the other side, you have the Union. The Union is the United States. It's the North side, but the North side wanted the Union to be everybody. Initially, it was everybody before they broke off, but eventually it was the Union against the Confederate States of America, and they wanted to stay united, which is similar root to Union. Border states, those are the states in between. So as I pulled these up, see if I can find some border states. They're not highlighted here, but we do have them highlighted in a couple of our other maps. But the border states are just in between. Like Virginia, it was kind of a flip-flop state. For the beginning, they're on one side of the war, and they flipped to the other side of the war. But like Virginia, Kentucky, those are border states. They're right in between. And Civil War is a war within a country. A country is battling against itself. Fort Sumter is where the first shot was fired of the entire Civil War. I think we already had compromise on here somewhere. I don't know that we need it on here twice. Compromise is right here. I'm going to delete this. Not sure what's there. Secede means to leave, to break off. So the Confederate States of America broke off. They left the Union. They left the United States, so they seceded. That's it for the study guide. I know that was kind of long. Hopefully it gives you a little bit of an idea. If there are areas, look through and see what do you know. And if you know it already, leave it alone. But if you don't know it, maybe circle it and go back over that section again. All of your notes, all of your homework to this point has led up to the tests. So if you're not sure, if some of the things I said don't make sense to you, go back through your notes and through your homework, and that should help you out. So